Well, how is your relationship with him now? You said
It's good. It's a real relationship. It's real. You know, we spend a lot of time.
Neil Young, the name alone conjures the image of a weathered troubadour, a man who never played by the rules, a restless artist who carved his legend in the bark of protest songs and feedback-drenched guitar solos. To his fans, he was always the uncompromising rebel, the voice of truth in a world of sellouts. His music had the raw honesty of someone who seemed allergic to conformity, someone who didn't just challenge the establishment, he haunted it. But what if we told you that behind the curtain of authenticity was a man quietly haunted by envy, reverence, and secret admiration for the very bands his audience would never associate with him? Neil Young, the outlaw of folk and rock, wasn't just inspired by a few fellow artists. No, he was obsessed deeply, personally, almost spiritually. And these obsessions weren't casual. They often shaped his direction, warped his confidence, and even threatened to unravel the image he so carefully built over decades. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on the 7 bands Neil Young revered in silence, artists that filled him with admiration, jealousy, confusion, and, above all, drive. These aren't just names on a playlist. These were ghosts in his studio, voices in his head, and shadows behind every chord he played. If you think you know Neil Young, this story will change everything. Long before Neil Young was the household name he is today's, before Crazy Horse, before Harvest, before he became the high priest of artistic independence, he was just a Canadian teenager in Winnipeg, crouched in his bedroom, trying to replicate the tremolo-drenched guitar licks of the Ventures. That's right, the Ventures. 4 guys from Seattle who made clean-cut surf rock for American teenagers to dance to in the summer sun. While Young's fans worshipped his acoustic purity and political lyrics, he was privately surrendering himself to instrumental surf records. Hours and hours of rewinding tracks, dissecting tone, imitating every bend and twang. This wasn't influence. This was ritual, and here's where it starts to twist. This infatuation with surf rock is what planted the seeds of his eventual electric transformation. When Young turned up the volume and embraced distortion, many critics thought he was following Dylan's path, but those close to him say he was channeling the Ventures, the band he was too embarrassed to admit he loved. The betrayal his folk fans felt when he went electric was nothing compared to the betrayal he felt for hiding this love in the first place. The Ventures didn't just teach Neil Young guitar tone, they cracked open a door that would later shatter the expectations of his most devoted followers. But surf rock wasn't the only ghost in Neil's closet. Inside his house, somewhere tucked between gold records and vintage amps, Neil kept something few people knew about: a shrine. Not for himself, not for his band, but for a man whose voice came from a darker place. Hank Williams, the godfather of country sorrow, the man who made heartbreak sound sacred. For Neil, Hank wasn't just a country singer, he was a blueprint for what it meant to be vulnerable. Young didn't just admire Hank's music, he studied it like a surgeon studies anatomy. Every crack in Hank's voice, every stumble, every stretch of silence, Neil believed it all meant something. He once said real music had to come from real pain. And in Hank Williams, he saw proof. But that belief took a toll. Because the deeper Neil went into Hank's world, the more he began to believe that suffering was necessary to be great. He began modeling his life around that pain, internalizing it, sometimes even manufacturing it. Friends noticed a shift. His joy seemed dulled, his relationships strained. It's said he even turned down moments of personal happiness because he felt they'd compromise his artistic integrity. That's the danger of worshiping your idols too deeply. You stop chasing their music and start chasing their ghosts. If Hank Williams was the blueprint for Neil's emotional depth, then the Beatles were the mirror he couldn't stop staring into and hating. From the moment they took over the world, Neil was torn between awe and bitterness. He was a Beatles fan. Of course, how could he not be? But behind the admiration was a quiet war inside himself. He dissected every Beatles record like a general studies the enemy's battle plan. He analyzed harmonies, lyrics, arrangements, trying not to be inspired but to compete. In private, Neil reportedly dismissed their fame as a product of charm and marketing, but those close to him knew the truth. He felt inferior, crushingly so, and what made it worse was that he knew deep down that they were better songwriters. That was the admission he could never make publicly. For years, his creative process became a mental battleground. He wasn't just writing songs, he was writing responses. Attempts to prove, if not to the world, then at least to himself, that he belonged in the same breath as Lennon and McCartney. The pressure of that self-imposed rivalry led to insomnia, anxiety, even creative paralysis. What started as admiration had morphed into a toxic obsession. And the Beatles, they never knew. The greatest competition Neil Young ever faced wasn't on the charts. It was in his own reflection. And then came the rivalry that was real, public, and personal. Bob Dylan, the man whose shadow stretched across every inch of the 1960s folk revival. Dylan was everything Neil aspired to be: poetic, enigmatic, untouchable. But where Dylan floated above it all like a mystic, Neil was still in the trenches, wrestling with the weight of expectations and identity. On the surface, they were friends, colleagues in the same cause. But beneath that, there was a fire burning between them. Every Dylan album was an act of psychological warfare for Neil. He'd listen, analyze, break it down, not to appreciate, but to respond. He wanted to outright Bob Dylan, outweird him, outright him. The competition wasn't friendly, it was existential. Their fans loved to compare them, fueling the fire even more. It's said that Neil once rewrote a finished album after hearing a new Dylan release, furious that it didn't measure up. The admiration never faded, but neither did the resentment. In one interview, Neil spoke of Dylan with awe, then followed it with a subtle jab as if complimenting him too much would mean surrender. That's the strange thing about idols. The closer you stand to them, the more they threaten to expose the parts of you that fall short. Each of these 7 bands and, yes, we'll get to the rest, did more than influence Neil Young. They lived inside him. They shaped his contradictions. He loved surf rock, but pretended not to. He worshipped country sorrow, but pretended he was invincible. He envied rock legends, but pretended he didn't care. And maybe that's the truest thing about Neil Young. The man was a storm of contradictions. And in those contradictions, he made magic. The kind of magic that could only be born from inner chaos. These 7 bands weren't just favorites. They were confessions. And for Neil, every guitar solo, every howl, every silence in his music, they weren't just artistic choices. They were messages to the idols he could never quite shake. And maybe, in the end, that's what makes his music so eternal. Not the purity, not the rebellion, but the quiet, aching truth that even the most fearless artists are just fans at heart, broken, inspired, and desperately trying to measure up to the voices that once woke them in the dark. Dylan and Neil Young, 2 towering legends of folk rock, bound together by era, artistry, and a rivalry that was far from poetic. On the surface, they shared stages, mutual respect, and admiration for millions. But behind closed doors, a quieter war was raging. Dylan, always the elusive prophet, allegedly mocked Young's voice in private, calling it whiny, forced, even pretentious. Those close to him claimed it was more than casual teasing, it was biting, and it left scars. Neil never responded publicly. He didn't have to. His fury lived in the music. Friends described Neil fuming after these remarks, obsessing over Dylan's lyrics, dissecting his metaphors, desperate to find a crack in the armor. But he couldn't. Dylan's lyrical genius was undeniable. And the day they finally collaborated, that day crushed Neil Young in a way no critic ever could. During recording sessions, Young appeared visibly shaken, defeated, as if standing next to Dylan stripped him of every ounce of confidence he'd spent decades building. Witnesses saw it in his eyes, realization, maybe even horror, that he would never reach that level of lyrical immortality. That moment wasn't just humbling, it broke something. From that point on, every song Neil wrote became a silent battle cry, not against the world but against Dylan, the man he could never surpass. The rivalry poisoned his creativity. Songs stopped being about expression and started being about comparison. Chasing Dylan's shadow consumed him. The ghost of a superior competitor haunted every note. Neil strummed every word he wrote. He began to self-sabotage, unintentionally tanking commercial potential in a twisted effort to preserve his own artistic credibility. Dylan had become a mirror Neil couldn't look away from, and that mirror reflected a truth he was never ready to accept. But if Dylan was the competitor who wounded his pride, Elvis Presley was the idol who shattered his heart. Early in his life, Neil Young didn't just love Elvis, he revered him. The hip-swinging outlaw from Memphis was everything Young aspired to be. He studied Elvis's stage movements with religious devotion, mimicked his vocal inflections until they became muscle memory. Industry insiders recall how Neil would spend hours practicing the King's every gesture in front of a mirror, convinced that if he could just harness that energy, he'd unlock the secret to rock and roll transcendence. For a time, it worked. Neil was invigorated. Elvis was the beacon, the gold standard. But everything changed when Neil witnessed what Vegas had done to the King. The rhinestone suits, the bloated arrangements, the hollow spectacle. To Neil, it was betrayal. The ultimate symbol of rebellion had morphed into a parody of himself, and it hit Neil like a freight train. That wasn't just Elvis on stage in Vegas, it was a cautionary tale. Neil saw his own potential, future unraveling in real time. Fame, comfort, applause could all be poisoned. The disillusionment broke him in a different way. He allegedly confided to friends that Elvis's decline terrified him, that it made him question every success he ever achieved. That fear shaped everything. It's the reason Neil would torpedo albums with abrupt genre shifts. It's why he'd walk away from money, walk away from labels, walk away from comfort, because comfort looked like Vegas, and Vegas looked like death. The trauma of watching Elvis fall from grace didn't just hurt Young, it rewired him. Every decision he made after that was a desperate effort to stay authentic, to never ever become a joke in a jumpsuit. But even more haunting than fame lost was perfection Neil Young could never touch. Enter the Everly Brothers. Don and Phil Everly weren't just chart-topping crooners to Neil, they were musical soulmates that he envied with quiet, tortured reverence. The harmonies, so effortless. The chemistry, so instinctive. Neil didn't just admire them, he obsessed. Alone in his studio, he'd spend sleepless nights trying to recreate their sound with layered guitar tracks and doubled vocals. But it was never enough. No matter how much he practiced, no matter how many takes he recorded, he knew deep down that he would never replicate what came naturally to the Everly. Their genetic connection was something Neil could never buy, borrow, or fake, and that crushed him. It's said that every musical partnership Neil attempted afterward, Crosby, Stills, Nash, Crazy Horse, Pearl Jam, carried with it the burden of that impossible standard. He wanted more than collaboration. He wanted communion. He wanted to feel what the Everlys felt when their voices locked in harmony, like blood relatives sharing one musical soul. But it never happened. The chemistry always felt forced. Every harmony fell short. And the result? Frustration, disillusionment, distance. Neil became notoriously difficult to work with, not because he lacked talent or drive, but because he was chasing a bond he would never achieve. He wasn't just seeking great music. He was seeking the intimacy of brothers he never had. And knowing he'd never find it, that he was destined to remain a musical loner, was a quiet devastation that followed him into every session, every stage, every song. But the most shocking truth about Neil Young's secret musical obsessions wasn't the rivalry with Dylan, the heartbreak from Elvis, or the longing stirred by the Everly Brothers. It was this: the single most influential figure in Neil Young's entire career wasn't an American icon or a British sensation. It was Hank Snow, a fellow Canadian, a name many fans today barely remember. But to Neil, Hank Snow was everything: the route, the map, the master. His obsession with Snow went far beyond influence. Neil made secret trips to Nashville just to study his songwriting techniques. He hunted down obscure Hank Snow records like a scholar piecing together lost scripture. To Neil, Snow wasn't just a country legend, he was a prophet. And here's the bombshell few knew: Neil Young's iconic identity, the wandering storyteller, the lonesome troubadour, the poetic rambler, was not born from Neil's own originality. It was borrowed, almost entirely, from Hank Snow's legacy. The train imagery, the tales of drifting souls, the melancholy ballads, they weren't Neil's inventions. They were Hank's. And Neil knew it. That truth clawed at him for years. It led to increasingly dense, sometimes alienating lyrics, as he tried to distance himself from the man he owed everything to. The irony was brutal. While critics praised Neil Young's authenticity and innovation, he was secretly haunted by the fear that he was nothing more than a rock and roll repackage of a country master long forgotten by the masses. He didn't just love Hank Snow, he resented him. Because Snow represented the impossible standard, the unreachable origin. And every time Neil picked up a guitar, he wasn't just writing a new song, he was trying to outrun a ghost who had already said it better, years before. Hank Snow didn't just shape Neil Young's sound, he shattered Neil's confidence in his own originality. And that unshakable doubt, hidden deep beneath the accolades, became the driving force behind a lifetime of restless reinvention. So there it is, the dark, unspoken truth behind the legend. Neil Young wasn't just a revolutionary. He was a disciple, a man whose fiercest rivalries, deepest loves, and most agonizing insecurities were all shaped by the very artists he pretended not to admire. These weren't just favorite bands, they were obsessions that lit a fire under his career and burned holes through his identity. From Dylan's lyrical daggers to Elvis's commercial collapse, from the Everly's impossible harmony to Hank Snow's haunting legacy, every one of them left a mark on Neil Young's soul. And now, we finally see the man behind the myth. Not the fearless rebel, but the vulnerable fan, the jealous peer, the heartbroken imitator, the man who lived in the shadows of giants and somehow still became one himself.